Hello, welcome. My name is Dan Rodney, and today for Noble Desktop, I'm going to be talking about Intro to UI Design. For those who aren't familiar, Noble Desktop is a training school in New York City, and we teach people how to design and code. The link to this slide deck here is in the video description down below, so if you want to reference anything that's in here, just check out the video description for this link. We keep this page up. To navigate the slides, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard, or if you're on a touch screen, you can swipe through the slides as well. All right, so today you're going to learn about what goes into designing and building websites and applications, how UI and UX design relate to each other, although we're going to be focusing on UI design, what apps are used in UI design, techniques and tools. Things like wireframing, prototyping, visual design, typography, UI kits. We'll go through a variety of these things so you understand what they do, the purpose of them, and kind of have a framework of what goes on in UI design and ways to continue your learning. I'm going to turn off my webcam here so you can focus on the slides here and that I don't cover them over. So what exactly goes into designing and building apps and websites? Well, designers need to create the layout, graphics, typography, so you're creating the look and feel of these digital products. Now, a developer will later have to go in and code that to make it into a fully functional website or application. It is important to know that our design apps, such as Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch, do not produce final websites and apps. That's something that developers will build using code. So we design, they build, and we're going to use design apps that are not responsible for actually building those things. Kind of like if you are planning a building. You don't just go start slapping up 2x4s and hoping that the thing doesn't fall down. No, somebody's going to design the building, make sure it's architecturally safe, then someone else is going to actually build the building. Same kind of idea with user interface design for something you're planning. The person planning and doing the final build are typically different people. Now, some people like to both design and code. Like for a website, you might want to design and code. You could be the same person, but you don't have to be the same person. So let's just, for a quick moment here, just separate for UX design and UI design. Today we're focusing on UI design, but you can't completely separate it from UX design. So what exactly is the difference, in case you're not clear? UX design is user experience design, and that is thinking about what it's like as a user to go through and use something. What is your experience like? We're talking about digital products today, but this technically could be other user experiences. Like, for example, if you're going to the Disney parks, they really consider what the experience of going through the whole park is like. But we're talking about digital products here. So ideally, this app or website or digital product should be easy to use. It should be intuitive, anticipate the needs of the person that's using it for an ideal user experience. It is user-centered design, and that means you're going to care about those users, which means you're going to need to get to know them. You need to do some user research, or else you're just guessing what you think is important to users. This involves developing the product, because if that product does not meet the needs of users, then you're going to have to go back and think about the features that it has and make sure that the product does meet those needs. That also requires testing on users to make sure that things will work well and that it meets the needs of users. If you want to read more about in depth about what UX design is, we have a blog article that you can click this link here and go out and read more about UX design. So contrasting that to UI design, which is the focus of today, user interface design, or UI design, is about designing the visuals of digital products like websites and apps. So these have a user interface, the interface, the thing that you see as you are using it. User interface designers are concerned about the layouts, the typography, the color, the composition, the visuals, what it is that people see. This does influence the user experience, but a UI designer is more focused on kind of the how it looks side of things, whereas the UX side of things is concerned more with how it works. These two are inevitably linked, of course. When you're talking about UI design, some people are going to call it visual design. So UI design, visual design, kind of similar things. If somebody says I'm a visual designer, I would have to clarify exactly what they do. because it technically might be doing other things, but sometimes people call UI design visual design. And when you're thinking about designing digital products, these things are interactive. So unlike a static medium such as print, if you're switching over from something like print, UI design is going to include new concepts like user interaction and animation, because these are digital moving things. They don't have to be a static thing like a piece of paper that gets printed out. So with UX and UI, these are things you cannot completely separate from each other. They are linked together, and some people do both. Some people are going to do both the UX and the UI design. Other people are going to concentrate on just one area of design, the one that they feel that they're either better at or more talented at, the type of design that they like better. You can do both, but you can specialize in one. If you have both UX and UI designers, they often work together because one needs to inform the other. If UX and UI designers worked separately and didn't talk to each other, that would not be good for the design workflow. So here's an example. Let's say a UX designer is doing user research. They're creating personas, which help to define the types of users that most typically will be using that website or app. They will do early wireframes, planning out the hierarchy, and we'll talk more about what wireframes are in a little bit. I'll show you some examples of them. But they're planning out kind of where things go, the blocking out the hierarchy. They think about information architecture, like how do you separate things into different tabs of an app? What is the website navigation? All that sort of stuff. That is what UX designers can do. And then they can pass that information on to a UI designer who can then come in and continue developing those designs, refining the wireframes, making them look better, and bringing in typography and color and composition and making the visuals look really nice. And so it's a kind of an integrated process between UX and UI, and they work together. And if you want to do both, that's something that you can do both, but there are different things that go into both types of design. Just as an example of things that, let's say you're a UI designer, things that you might get from a UX designer for you to continue to develop. Let's go take a look at some of these things here. If you are a UX designer, these are the kind of things you'd be producing, but these are also things that might inform a UI designer so that they can then take this information and continue working on it. So things like personas, which talk about the different types of users. So when you're designing, you can look at those personas and know the kind of people that will be using the app or website. Make sure that your design is going to be visually attractive and useful for those people. Things like journey maps and wireframes and storyboards, these things are all going to help you see the flow of going from one place to another, see how users will flow through something. Let's continue going through here. UX designers would think about the content that gets put into place, which when you get to that point and you're the UI designer, that content would already be there. They might think about the different pages or screens of the app, plot that out as a sitemap. Here's the user flow. So you'd be thinking, okay, from this screen or this web page, they go to this one. How does it flow through? So that stuff a UX designer could do and then pass it off to a UI designer who would then go through and make those screens look nice. That's where the interface or UI comes in. And so something like a wireframe, that could be done potentially by UX or UI designers. It depends. Every UX designer you talk to, every UI designer you talk to would probably say maybe something a little different as far as what they do. There's a different balance. There's definitely an overlap between these things as far as who does what. Even prototyping, which is making clickable things that you can walk through your app or website. Whose role is that? Is that something that UX designers do early on, but then they pass it on to UI designers who continue to develop it, maybe need to do more prototyping? It's not always a clear delineation of UX designers always do one thing and UI designers do another. There can be that kind of mixed blend in the middle where it could be one or the other. If you want to see some more deliverables here, we can look at this portfolio here as well of a UX designer. And when you're looking at this, these things are not necessarily refined, beautiful visuals because they're solving earlier problems, figuring out problems in things like user flows where people are getting stuck, defining better flows through the website or the app to help inform what is going to be on what screens are going to be available, doing card sorting to figure out maybe potentially the architecture of the app or the website, doing early wireframes, which again don't focus on being beautiful. They focus on kind of hierarchy, making sure the right stuff is in the right place, research that could be passed on to a UI designer. So that's the type of stuff that UX designers can do without focusing too much on that side of things. Then the UI designer comes in and their job is to make everything look beautiful as well as still working well, because what you do as a UI designer can make something hard to use as well. So we're focusing on maintaining that usability and making things beautiful as well. I know you have all been on websites before, but when we're looking at these two examples of websites, analyze them from a designer perspective. Don't think of them so much from a user perspective, but think about the design and the thoughts that went into doing that design. Stripe.com. If you're not familiar with them, they have an amazing design team, talented designers, and also very talented developers as well. Everybody that's designing and building this Stripe website is definitely talented. They're always having interesting designs, and whenever they redesign it, they kind of are doing trend-setting design with this cool animated gradient here. And one of the things that Stripe does in terms of its branding, if I zoom in on the logo here, the Stripe branding has this slash. It has this diagonal line to it on the bottom of the P, the top of the T, and in the I itself. And so they're going to use that diagonal slash throughout their branding at certain points. They don't overuse it so that you get sick of it, but they use it at certain places, like in here. Here they just have a straight line, so they don't always use it every single time to overdo it. As we scroll through here, they have nice animations. Every once in a while, they still throw in that slash every once in a while. Nice little divider sometimes with that slash. They have nice, tasteful use of animations to draw your attention in to things that you're doing. This is for developers going in and using the Stripe API to charge credit cards. So this is aimed at developers in this case. And then you see little icons here that are animating as well. Again, that little diagonal line there. So they've got this nice system of color in place where all the colors work well together. Their branding is worked throughout the design. Nice little animations that are put through here, some of which are interactive. Like here I can actually drag around this globe here to interact with it, and actually when I press, the little dots kind of float off of the earth, and then when I let go they kind of go back down. So that's a cool animation. That not only requires a good designer to kind of design how it looks, but also a really good developer to be able to program that to make it work as well. So this is really where it's a combination of designers and developers coming together to be able to make something work like that and to look good. Again, nice little animations every once in a while, just subtle little things to kind of catch your eye. Nice hierarchy, there's a good amount of space here, so clearly delineated different sections. Your eye goes to the main important parts. If you don't want to read the extra stuff, it's kind of lighter, you don't have to. If you're interested, you might read it. Clear calls to actions for doing things, some of which are more important, some of which are less important. So nice use of space, nice use of typography, alignment, branding, color, just everything done really nicely on the Stripe website. Now, the Harvard Law Review. If I would have you picture this, let's say you've never seen this before. My guess is probably a lot of you will not have ever been on the Harvard Law Review website. But if you're picturing it in your mind, what do you picture? Do you picture a beautiful website, or do you picture the law being this kind of boring thing? Obviously, the law is very text heavy. So let's actually go and take a look at it. It's actually a very beautiful website. Typographically speaking, it is a beautiful example of typography on the web. They chose very nice typefaces. They worked in some color in certain places, because if it's just plain black and white with no color, it might be a bit boring, but they worked in some abstract things because a lot of the law doesn't have visuals. And so how do they incorporate some color? How do they incorporate some visuals? By using abstract stuff. And it's warm color scheme, so it kind of warms it up to make it a bit more approachable. They have some nice rules that are kind of fine rules here. And one of the things they did to make this more legible, more readable, because it is a lot of reading that someone would do on this website, is the navigation is a solid white, but the rest of the page background is an off-white. It's kind of a yellowed white, kind of like the off-white of a piece of paper. And the text is not quite solid black. It's actually a slight shade of gray. It's a dark gray. And by choosing not full-on black and full-on white, which would be a very high contrast, which might be a little bit hard to read because it's a little more eye strain because it's so contrasty, they just reduce the contrast just a little bit. Still very easy to read, but just makes it a bit more subtle and a little less harsh on the eye. And also a little bit more paper, kind of akin to reading on a sheet of paper. And the columns are not so wide, so you don't get overwhelmed with just a lot of text covering the entire screen. And just a nice reading experience. When you get down to the bottom, they put in nice little visuals here with the shape that's there, the balance that they did with like Facebook and Twitter on the left and the right, with a nice little join your mailing list right here centered in the middle. The HLR kind of looking like those initials, like a nice little emblem there to remind you that you're on the Harvard Law Review website. And again, the color background is nice. And the typography is done really well. You've got clear delineation of the different types of text, with each thing being styled differently. So they clearly look different. They chose a beautiful typeface. The typeface for reading is very easy to read, and the large heading, because it's so large, they could choose a typeface that has nice little details in there. So those are just some examples of websites there, kind of focusing on the UI design that they have done in there. Now, for apps, you're going to find a wider variety of different types of design, because with apps can really specialize in certain tasks. They could be one app that just does shopping, one that just does social media, one that just is a camera. Some apps do a lot of different things, but like a game is just for playing that one game. And the user interface for a game could be potentially entirely different than what you need for a social media network. That, like you think about something like Facebook, where you need the marketplace and you need pages and you need so many different types of things. They have news, they have video. It's like the Swiss Army knife of social media. They have everything in there. They have to have a more complicated UI than just a camera or a game, which tries to do one specific thing. So again, you probably all used an app on your mobile phone, but when you're looking at some of these things, look at it through the eye of a designer, thinking about why were certain decisions made about that user interface. Why were those things done? And looking for things that are different across apps, things that are common across apps. Like common things would be the tab bar at the bottom, right? So all these apps here have a tab bar, although even though they all have a tab bar, the way they indicate the currently selected tab is different across all of them. So there can sometimes be similarities, but yet flexibility within those commonalities that you could do different things. And with each app, you're looking at kind of a dedicated interface for that particular focus of what that app does. The focus of a mapping app could be very different than an exercise workout app. And so you have to consider, for an app, what is the focus, what is the flow, and the way that you flow through from screen to screen potentially is going to be very different going through a game, for example, than going through a social media app or a camera app or a to-do app or whatever that is. So you will see a wider variety of different types of user interfaces, I think, when it comes to apps compared to websites. When this website right here, this is an interesting one because it allows you to browse a bunch of different screenshots on different apps. You can see them on both iOS or Android. and you can search through if you're looking for specific things, and you can look at it by the app or the kind of screen that you're interested in. And there's different filtering categories here that you can look through. But it's nice because, especially if you don't have these particular apps, you can see multiple screenshots across those apps, kind of look for commonalities, look for ideas of user interface. And there's one particular page here, the dictionary page, which I've linked to also in the presentation here to not miss that. When you go to the dictionary page, they actually break it down by different types of things that you're looking at, different user interface patterns. So if your app needs a pull to refresh, where you pull down and it refreshes, you can look at a variety of examples of how different apps will do pull to refresh. Or a loading state, where something is loading, what are you going to show when that thing is loading? An empty state, what if somebody's not put anything in yet? What if they haven't created a trip? What if they haven't created any questions or videos? If it's just a blank empty screen, it might look like a mistake. But if you can say like, oh, there's nothing there yet, and maybe give them a way to put something there, right? Like, oh, you don't have any questions, but you can add a topic. Oh, you don't have any trips. Well, is there a way to create a trip? Maybe I could create a trip here. So designing for those empty states, which a lot of times your app might start empty until you start to fill it in. You want to think about those things. So if you're looking for specific types of interfaces and examples of those, like login screens and sign-up pages, they're going to have a lot of different examples of that here on this website. So that's a great resource that you can use to look that up beyond your own experience of using apps yourself. As far as design apps that we use to create our user interface designs, so how do we build these ourselves? There's three main apps that are kind of competing right now. There's Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch. Now, related to those, we do also use Photoshop for doing photo editing and some graphic work. We also do use Illustrator for potentially drawing icons, creating illustrations. Those are kind of standard design apps that a lot of designers typically know with Photoshop and Illustrator. But when it comes to building the actual layouts for your designs, for apps and websites, it's these first three that people are going to be using. They're made by three different companies, but they aim to do fundamentally the same thing. Sketch is only available for the Mac, and it was the first of all of these. Then Adobe XD and Figma came right around about the same time. Adobe XD and Figma both work on Mac and PC. And in fact, Figma is also available as a web app. You could just log into figma.com in any web browser, so it can work on any platform that has a web browser to it. You don't actually have to install a native app, although there is one available that you can use. Sketch got its early lead in the market. It was years ahead of Adobe XD and Figma. So a lot of people are using Sketch, and most designers are Mac users. So for a lot of people, that's not a problem, but there are some people that use Windows and want to design. And so in that case, Adobe XD and Figma are better for Windows users, of course. But Sketch got its lead, or its purpose originally was as a vector drawing app. It was called Sketch, kind of like Illustrator is called Illustrator. It was meant to be a vector design tool. And people said, hey, this is a really simple, easy to use vector design tool. This would be great for doing user interface. And so they started just designing things like app icons and user interfaces in Sketch. And then they quickly pivoted to focusing on user interface design. Eventually, they started adding prototyping tools, but that was really after everybody else added native prototyping tools. In the early days, Sketch was reliant on other third-party integrations like InVision. And with InVision, you could take your Sketch designs, or back in the day, back when Photoshop was being used for UI design, you would take those designs into InVision and you could do clickable prototypes. So they waited a long time to kind of add prototyping features. And while they have some basic prototyping features built in, which allow you to create these kind of clickable designs that you can do user testing on and show clients and developers, Sketch is behind when it comes to prototyping. Adobe XD and Figma are much farther ahead. They can do a lot more prototyping features, and they also build in animation into those prototyping features, which Sketch doesn't really have any of those animation features. So right now, what Sketch kind of has going for them is that early lead in terms of the amount of people using it. But in terms of features, Adobe XD and Figma have jumped ahead, even though they were released much later. They have more features that you can use, so they're more capable apps. And Sketch has been starting to fall behind more recently, and not adding features as rapidly as Adobe XD and Figma. So it'll be interesting to see over the coming years exactly how that competition works out. Competition's always good for us designers. They all want you to use their app, and that's good that one company doesn't just own the market. They all have to compete, and that's just driving these apps forward and making them better every month. So, but these are the three kind of main apps that people are using today. If you want to see more comparison about those three particular apps, tomorrow I'm doing a webinar that compares those three apps specifically, and you can see which one you think you want to use. If you're watching a recording of this, that webinar might already be up here on our YouTube channel, so check that out. But for anybody watching live, you can tune back in tomorrow for a shootout between those three apps if you want to see more specifically. So wireframes, I talked a little bit about wireframes before, but what is a wireframe? A wireframe is kind of showing roughly kind of like a pencil sketch in a way, like a digital pencil sketch of where things are going to go. So it is a visual guide that represents page content, structure, and it's for establishing hierarchy and flow, and it's meant to be something that you can do kind of quickly and work out your priorities. So you're showing like rough placement. You don't have to be worrying about all the specific alignments and spacing and things. It doesn't have to look beautiful. And you're trying to block out where your content goes, navigation, calls to actions, columns, that type of stuff. So you're trying to work out your priorities and the flow from screen to screen. Wireframes do not focus on color, typefaces, graphics, and beautiful refined visuals design, because we don't want to waste time on that right now. We want to work out quickly what the big picture of our design is. Now, this is an example of a wireframe that is pretty much useless at this stage. Like, this could fit potentially any website. It's just too generic. And if you just say like navigation, okay, well, what's in the navigation? Banner. What's in the banner? Which three things are you featuring? Oh, there's a footer. Well, what's going to go in the footer? This really doesn't tell me anything. This could be literally any website, and I don't know if it's accurate or not. It's not enough information. So you're going to need to get more detailed than that, like actually putting in what's really in the nav. What is in the banner? What's the call to action? What three things are you featuring? And if there's other things down below, other stuff down below. That's going to help that when a client looks at this, they're going to be like, oh no, that's not very important. We shouldn't be featuring that. We should be featuring this other thing. Oh, and start with cloud integration, because that's going to save them time, and reorder these things. See, that is tangible information that you can really use to make judgments as to whether this is good or not. So try to be using real content whenever possible. Don't just go the easy route and just block it out and say navigation, footer, because any client could be like, sure, that's fine. You don't really learn anything if you're too generic with that stuff. You're not worrying about colors. You're not worrying about fonts. You're just representing things like images, which is a box. A lot of wireframes, you'll see them have the little X in there, and you could do that, but to be honest, a lot of the design apps don't actually have something that has an X through the middle of it. So most of the time I just draw a box, and that box just represents an image that's going to be there. I don't spend time thinking about the specific image, choosing that specific image, because that can take a lot of time. And if the fundamental idea of what I'm trying to show, if the client's like, oh no, we have to go in a different direction for this or that, that whole area might get scrapped and we have to do something different. So the idea is you want to kind of fail fast with these wireframes and figure out what doesn't work and what does work in terms of hierarchy and flow. So the purpose is really to figure out what needs to be where. And one thing I should say is that the wireframing process is something that UX or UI designers may potentially do. So if you are a UI designer, these might be provided to you, or if you're more involved in that part of the process, you might be the one that's doing this. So somebody else might be doing the UX side of this, doing this, and they just give you these finished wireframes that you will then make look nice. So it figures out what content needs to be where, make sure we have all the content and that it's in its proper place. Figure out how things are organized. What's the hierarchy of importance? What's going to go first? What's going to go second? What's the order of things in the screens, on the pages, whatever we're designing? where are users going to go? Like, okay, so imagine somebody coming here, they read through the content. What are they going to click on? What's their call to action? Where are they going to go? What's going to be on that next page? Is there a call to action when they need it, where they are at that moment? Thinking about the flow of users. Again, this is user experience type design, what I'm talking about here. But this is where, some people do UX and UI. It's kind of a blended thing. Might be done for you, and you're the UI designer and you get a finished wireframe. And I think of wireframes as they're a thing that you can do quickly without spending a lot of time on the minutia of like worrying about the exact spacing and exact alignment and color and typography. All that stuff can take time. And wireframes are meant to be quick in that you don't waste time on all those things, because if your fundamental design is flawed, you could have spent a lot of time making this design beautiful, but your fundamental foundation that you're building it on was flawed, and you got to redo the whole thing again. So you want to do this quickly. And I'm not saying that wireframes necessarily are quick, because on a complicated project, wireframes can actually take a long time, but it will be faster doing them as wireframes than doing them as final beautiful designs, because that would take even more time than just building a wireframe. So think of them as kind of like a sketch before you pen and ink your final drawing. All right. Now, once you've got wireframes and you move on to designing things, so let's talk about various different design things that are going to come up when you're designing native apps. And there's website stuff, but what about designing native apps? When you're designing a mobile, and we're talking mobile apps here, but same would actually apply if you're doing Mac apps or Windows apps, or let's say console system for a game or for a car in infotainment system. But the operating system itself, like iOS for iPhone and iPad or Android, they will provide standard user interface elements, whether you want to call them elements or widgets or whatever. There's going to be date pickers, or tab bars, buttons, toggle switches, all these types of built-in things that look like the OS has designed them to look, and they are given to you to use in your native apps. There are also standard conventions for that platform that are recommended to make best use of that platform's features. So this is maybe the way that an app is designed to work. Like that iOS apps typically have a back button at the top left of the app, as opposed to Android, which has a back button built into the bottom of the screen in a lot of cases. So there's specific things to how that platform works that you would need to consider when designing the app for that particular platform. Just as an example of some kind of standard UI widgets, here in iOS, on the left we have OmniFocus, and on the right we have Apple's own built-in calendar app. Totally different apps doing different things. One is a to-do app, one is a calendar, but they both have a calendar part, because if you're creating a to-do, you would schedule that potentially for a date that is to be finished by. And when you're creating an event for a calendar, then of course you need to choose from the calendar. When you look at the calendar part itself, this is the same kind of calendar chooser in both apps, because that's built into the system that you get this thing. This is designed exactly the same because it's given to you by the operating system. That's important to understand, because number one, if you were designing this, you don't have to design that user interface. You could just use what's built into the OS, the operating system, right? The OS, the operating system, iOS or Android, and you don't have to design that. That's one less thing for you to design, and you will feel native to that platform because you're using an interface that lots of other apps are using for that particular task, that particular thing. For example, anytime you have, let's say, a picker for time, in this case it's a pop-up, in this case it's the whole width, but iOS has this kind of scroller, almost like it's like a 3D wheel that you flip through. And whether it's in a pop-up or not, it's still the same kind of scroller. That's not designed by the app. That's given to you by the operating system. And so people are used to that. If you're on iOS, you use these little scrollers so you can scroll up and down through these hours and minutes and AM and PM. That's going to be universal because the operating system provides that stuff. So you want to become used to those standard user interface elements like the toggle switch. The toggle switch is a standard thing. If you want to make a toggle, you don't need to design your own toggle switch. You can use the iOS toggle switch that all iOS apps use. Can you design a custom one? Yes. But the question is, should you design your own custom one? Everybody knows what an iOS toggle switch looks like and how it works and the color coding and everything, that if it's off versus if it's on, it's green. Should you design a custom one? That's really the question. So when you're designing those native apps, by using those provided UI elements that the OS gives you, your app is going to feel native to that platform. If you come up with your own custom design, it's not going to feel native. It'll feel like a foreigner in a foreign land that sticks out because they're not taking on the customs of that foreign land. You'll feel out of place on iOS if you don't work like other iOS apps. You'll feel out of place on Android if you don't work like typical Android apps. Yes, you can do your own thing, but the question is, should you? One advantage of using those native elements is that many people will already know how to use those because so many apps already use those, as opposed to your own custom designed ones. If you design your own custom ones, not only do you have to design that's another thing for you to design. It's another thing for developers to have to code because they have to code their own custom user interface now. But also the usability potentially can suffer because if the built-in one to the OS works and people know it, that's going to be easier for people to use because they don't have to relearn it for your app. They've already used it for other apps. So that can potentially improve usability. The alternative would be if that built-in widget just isn't good, if it doesn't suit the needs of your app, that would dictate designing your own custom one because maybe your app needs something different. It has different needs, and that might be a reason to develop your own custom one. But if you can use the one that's built into the OS, it's going to be cheaper to develop, cheaper to design because it's faster. You just use the one that they give you, and you don't have to design your own custom one. So consider that to make your apps feel native, feel at home on the platform. Use what those platforms give you. And as an example, these are all well-documented stuff. Apple's Human Interface Guidelines gives you a lot of these guidelines. Google's Material Design is what they call it. The latest one is Material Design 3. These are all references where they talk in depth about designing for their platforms when you're designing native apps for macOS, iOS, watchOS, tvOS, whatever it is. So let's say you're doing an iOS, which would be iPad or iPhone. You can go into those, and there are lots of different things. They talk about concepts for how people are going to do user interaction, the capabilities of the operating system, so you know what you can and cannot do, the visual design, things like color and branding. They give you so many guidelines so that you will feel at home on their platform. Things like dark mode, for example, considering light and dark mode. How is that going to work, right? Icons, talking about your app icon, the system icons, like maybe there's certain icons that are built in that everybody knows because lots of apps use those built-in icons. So instead of designing your own, maybe should you use one that's built into the operating system so everybody knows what it is. Like on iOS, this is an action, a thing that you can share with other people, perform an action. And lots of apps use it because it's a standard operating system icon. So once you're doing these native apps, you have to consider what is given to me by the operating system that I can use so I feel native and I improve usability versus when do I have to design something custom. Same thing with Google Material Design. They've got a lot of information here as well. Styles, colors, icon, typography, buttons, different UI elements here. You can browse this too as well. They talk all about those things. Okay. And you'll also notice that you'll get things like design kits in Figma. So that's one of the design apps that I talked about earlier. So lots of great documentation there to learn about what it's like to design custom native apps for Android or iOS. So just some examples of platform recommendations in those Apple Human Interface Guidelines. One of those guidelines, if you click on it here, it'll actually, if you scroll through and read here, they recommend that you try to maintain a minimum tappable area of 44 points by 44 points for all controls. So what they're talking about here is when you're looking at controls, whether they be this little eye icon or the plus that's there, that those little controls, those things that you would click on, that has a tappable area with your big fat finger that you're trying to aim at, that's 44 by 44 pixels at a minimum. It can be bigger, like the tabs that are at the bottom, they're going to be bigger than that, but at least the little things that you can tap, they don't want them to be too close to each other, because then your fat little finger might not touch the right correct thing. I think that that's actually a good recommendation for any platform, not just for iOS. You could apply the same thing for Android as well, because it's just you're using the same finger whether you're on Android or iOS, but that's from Apple's interface guidelines. So that translates into when you're in your design app like Figma, Adobe XD, or Sketch, the tappable area that you're designing should be at least 44 pixels. I know in Apple's case they talk about points, but in Figma and XD and Sketch that you're going to see pixels that you're going to be designing in. Now, one important thing to understand is that the icon itself does not have to fill that 44 pixels. That's the tappable area, which means some of that can contain space. It does not have to fill that whole area as long as there's enough space around it. As an example here, I took some screenshots of the little toggle switch, and the red box that you see here is 44 pixels. The keyboard on iOS, exactly 44 pixels tall, and the space that's on the left and the right. Notice that if you're trying to tap on that O key, there's a little bit of space on the left and the right, and that's exactly 44 by 44 pixels. So you got the height, so you don't accidentally tap the one that's below. You've got the width, so you don't accidentally tap the one next to it. And that's kind of the minimum space that they recommend. If you have more space, great, but that's the minimum. Notice that the button is not filling out that space. Notice the toggle switch is not filling out that space. So actually each one of these rows of the different settings, those rows are actually 44 pixels tall. Obviously a lot wider. You can actually tap anywhere on this whole row to go there, but the height is 44 pixels. That icon, no, that's not 44 pixels because the whole entire row is 44. So again, tappable space. Recommended be at least 44 pixels, left and right, width and height. All right. So UI kits. So those user interface elements that I was talking about for designing those native apps, there are design kits that are out there. I've linked two here to Figma, which are nice, but there are other ones out there for things like Adobe XD and Sketch. But these are just two examples that are really nice. And if I click on this link here to go out there, they have built all of the different major user interface elements here in Sketch. And let's actually zoom in on this here. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to link to this, because without having to install anything, you can actually zoom in and take a look. So if you're designing a pop-up menu, this is like the little edit menu here, right? You might actually go in and customize that. Or if you just want to see like, oh, I'm designing an app where I would want to potentially edit. Well, let's show what would happen if you're editing text. There are buttons. So you got a variety of buttons. You can have icons or not have icons. And toggle switches. So you get the toggle switches in there. You get slider controls. Dialogues here. Right, so you got some dialogues there. Nav bars. So at the bottom of your screen, a lot of apps have a tab bar at the bottom. Those tab bars will potentially have, you're always going to have at least two, right? You're not going to have a tab bar with just one, because then you don't even need a tab bar. So you'd at least have two. And at most you'd have 5. You really can't fit more than 5 for the most part. So they go up to 5. And they have ones that if you're on the iPhone that doesn't have a home button anymore, the iPhone 10 or later, you get the little line that's a bit wider. If you're on the older iPhones, it's a little narrower, and there's no little home bar button because home bar icon on screen, because they actually had the home button that they would press, so they don't need that little line. So these are going to be wider and taller than the older iPhone, back in the old iPhone 6, 7, 8 kind of generation. A little shorter, a little wider. They also have light mode and dark mode versions of it. So they give you all of this stuff here that you can use. This is a free app here, not free app, but a free file that you can use. Segmented pickers here, so you can do like on off, different tabs here. You can go in and change the text to whatever you want. All of these things are given to you in these UI design kits. There's one for Google Material Design as well, with a variety of those different same types of things that are in there. Some of these have different pages, so you might have to switch between the pages, but lots of good stuff in there for, again, navigation bars, navigation drawer there, all different types of things. Text fields, so if you're putting in editable text in both light and dark mode. So amazingly here, lots of different UI stuff that you can just use to start wireframing or designing your app using all of those native elements that are built into the operating system. So really useful to get those UI kits. If you're using Adobe XD or Sketch, you can always go into Google and look for UI kits for those apps as well. So prototyping. Once you've got your design, if you've got a static design, you might want to make that clickable so people can go through and play with it, see how they like it, do some user testing. A client might want to kind of feel what it's like to use an app before the app gets built, before they pay developers to build it. So a prototype is this interactive representation, this interactive design of how the product will operate. It is not the actual product. It's not a website. It's not an app. It's just something that looks like it. And it might click, it might be clickable. It might function very much like the app would, but it's just an idea. Just like if you've ever seen a concept car, it's a prototype vehicle. It's like a one-off, and it's not the mass production. It's not exactly what the car is going to be like. Same thing with a prototype of an app. It's not the app. It's just simulating what it would be like for the most part to use it, but it might not be fully functional. Not everything would necessarily work. They're very useful for doing user testing. You can also show clients and developers how things are supposed to work. In the case of user testing, you could show a user this prototype, let them go and try to do things and say, okay, do this task, and then watch them and observe them and see how easy is it for them to do that. Do they get lost? Do they get stuck? How quickly do they accomplish that task? And see if there's any problems that arise that need to be fixed. All of this is being able to be done with just your design app, and you don't have to get to the coding process where you involve developers. You can make it at any point. This could be done at early wireframe stage, where you still want to do some user testing at that early stage before you spend a lot of time and money and effort making beautiful, refined visual designs. But then also as you go in and you refine and make your beautiful visual design or UI design better, it's still a prototype. So you can still continue to develop it, make changes as are necessary, and continue to do user testing and showing it to clients and developers. Now, the visual design side of things, some people call it visual design, some people just call it UI design. That is the idea of the visuals that you're doing, making things look visually attractive. Color, typography, composition, balance, all that sort of stuff to make something look great. Keep in mind that the visual design does affect usability and the overall user experience. Let's go through just a couple examples. For example, you design type that's too small or too faint, like the contrast is too light. That can make it hard to read. And you might think it looks nice, but maybe for somebody that has vision impairments that can't read so well, that's a bad user experience. So it's hard to completely separate the user experience from the user interface and the visual design because they are inevitably linked together. Content can be hard to scan, and I think that's important when you're first looking at a page or a screen. You want to be able to scan it, get a sense of what's there, and that can be hard to do if you're not using proper spacing, proper typography to convey hierarchy, aligning things well. So if everything's just crammed together and all the same size, nothing stands out. So you don't know what you should look at, and it all just looks like a jumbled mess. But if you use space to separate things, you use dark text to stand out versus the lighter text, you change your typography so certain things jump out at you and certain things recede. You can make something that's very easily scanned and understood and can both look good and also be easier to use as well. So speaking of typography, when you're doing native apps, the operating system also provides its own font that you can use. You don't have to use it, but you can. On iOS, it's San Francisco. On Android, it's Roboto is the system font. And if you use that font, you're going to kind of feel native to that platform because so many apps use that on that platform. Do you have to use that? No, you don't have to, but just consider that you might not feel as native to that platform if you're not using that particular font. Now, when it comes to websites or apps, you can use custom fonts. But keep in mind that certain things on a website or an app might require some small text, and it needs to be a font that's legible. For example, if you're doing an app, the labels on the tabs that are at the bottom, a lot of times those tab labels are quite small. That text needs to be legible. On a website, like the copyright at the bottom, it needs to be there. You need to be able to read it, but it should be small, but still legible, that somebody could read it if they really want to. And there's sometimes little labels on things, again, that are smaller, but still need to be legible. And when you're doing custom typefaces, it certainly changes the character of it. And on websites, I feel no need to feel at home on the operating system. I'm not going to use San Francisco or Roboto on a website because websites have their own character and feel. And some people would say, well, what about an app? And I could see it going either way. Certainly an app would feel different if they are using a different font. It depends on, I think, where you're using the typeface. Like in the tab bar at the bottom, if you're using a typeface that's not quite as easy to read and it's off, it might feel out of place versus the default system font. But that said, like on a sign-up screen or in certain screens, there can be, like if you're reading articles or something in an app, like a news app or something, if you're choosing a different font, that you might have a beautiful reading font. So it depends on what you're doing as to whether you should use the native OS font or not when it comes to apps. But for websites, I don't feel the need. In fact, I generally would never use the San Francisco font or Roboto font typically on most websites, but I never like to say never. It just depends on what I'm doing. It does bring up a question, and something that you need to think about is font licensing. This is something that a lot of people don't think of, but you should, because you need to make sure you have a proper font license for your project. And you got to make sure that, because pricing is dictated by the foundry, the people that make that font, you need to make sure that, first of all, that they license it for the use that you want and that you can afford that license. For example, FontSpring has use-specific pricing. So depending on how you're going to use it, they're going to price it differently. Here's just one font. They have lots of fonts on this website. If you go to purchase that family, what are you going to do? Are you going to just use it on a desktop? Like you're using it in a design app, are you using it in PowerPoint, using it in Word, using it in Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, whatever it is, you can add that to your cart. Okay. Now you also want to use it on a website. That's something else. So here you get 5 people get to use that font on a desktop to design it. You want a web font? Okay. Well, then you'd also need to add that as well. And it would be dependent on how many views that website gets on a monthly basis. Now, they say over here, licensed by page views, the number of total visits your site may receive in a month. There's no tracking, there's no subscriptions. These are one-time fees that they give. That's the license for this site. Other sites might have a totally different license. So you always have to check for where you're purchasing it, what the license is. Sometimes it might be a subscription. Sometimes it might not be. It depends on the license and the people that are making it. If you're doing an application, like a mobile app, well, that's another price that you would pay, right? And if I remove all these things from my cart here, just look, normally apps are more expensive, at least on the site here. Web fonts are cheaper, desktop fonts, but for some reason, embedding it into an app, I don't know, maybe because it's newer, and maybe there's more investment, startup money in it, they charge more for apps. Why? Because that's what they want to charge, and they can charge whatever they want. Doesn't mean you have to pay for it, but if you want to do it in an app, this is the price you would pay. Now, it's just a one-time fee. It's not a subscription or anything like that. So wherever you're getting it from, make sure that you have paid for the license and that it allows you to do what you want with that. Okay. So if you just purchase a web license and you don't get an app license, you can't use it in an app unless you go purchase that license. Just because it's free doesn't mean it's free for all uses. Might be free for personal use, but not free for commercial use. Also, just because you pay for it doesn't mean you can use it any way you want. Adobe fonts. With Adobe fonts, which are included in your Creative Cloud license, If you read that license agreement, it says that Adobe fonts can be used in websites. In fact, that's what it was designed for. It was Typekit was the company. Eventually, Adobe bought it, called it Adobe Typekit. Then they rebranded it as Adobe Fonts. Back when it was Typekit alone, all you could do was use it on a website. You could not even download it to your computer to design. If you wanted to do that, you'd have to buy a separate license. One of the big improvements that Adobe made was to renegotiate the licensing agreements so that not only could you use it on a website, but you could also download it to your computer to design in Adobe apps. That was a great improvement. But what you can't do with Adobe fonts is you cannot use them in apps. You have to go directly to the Foundry and purchase a separate license for that. And you can read that yourself if you look at the license. So yes, you're paying a subscription and you can use them in websites, you can use them in your Adobe apps, but if you're looking for an app, so can I embed fonts in a mobile or desktop application I'm building? And no, it says no. The license does not allow you to embed within mobile or desktop applications. This requires an appropriate license to be purchased directly from the Foundry or some authorized retailer. So make sure you have the license in doing whatever you're doing. Okay. So they'll tell you, yes, you can do this. No, you can't do that. Always read the license before you sell a client on a project. Because if you're like, oh, I love this font, and then you're like, oh, sorry, I can't do it. There's nothing worse than that. So always check the license before you even put it into your design. Make sure you have the license for that. All right, so that's been a bunch of things here. Just to wrap things up, the final thoughts. When you're designing, as you're getting started in it, design is about practice and honing your craft, getting better, and practice is the best way to do that. So as you're getting into things, you're learning your apps, you're learning design concepts, practice, practice, practice as much as you can. That's where you're going to get better. In the beginning, there's going to be a lot of things you're going to learn, and failure is part of learning, right? You're going to mess up things, you're going to see what doesn't work, but that's part of learning. You're going to see what doesn't work, and that means you're closer to figuring out what actually does work. So I always say you're never failing unless you're failing to learn. So as long as your failures are learning things that you can take something away from, you are learning. You're succeeding at learning, and have fun. For me, I love designing. Designing it's a cool industry to be in. It's a creative industry. You can have a lot of fun doing this stuff, and so if you want to learn more. If you want to learn more about the apps, if you want to learn more about this industry and actually make a career switch into it, we have classes that you can check out on the Noble Desktop website. We also have a certificate program. If you want to get into both UX and UI, we have a UX and UI design certificate. We do also have separate ones if you just want to get more into just the visual design of things, or if you just want to get into UX. But if you want to get into both and see both sides of things, we have a great program. All of our classes can be done both live online as well as in person in New York City. We're located about a block away from the Empire State Building. So all of the times on our website are in Eastern time. So keep that in mind. They are live online classes, so they're not on demand, pre-recorded. You'll screen share into an instructor's computer, be able to talk to them, ask them questions. There'll be hands-on practice. These webinars are just lecture style, kind of informative, but the classes, those are all hands-on classes where you're going to actually be learning and doing stuff in those programs, from learning the apps. You'll be using the apps, doing the design concepts. You'll be learning those concepts and implementing those in your projects. So it's a great way to learn and get started in this. Noble Desktop's been around for over 30 years. It's a great place to learn. The link to this presentation is down in the video description down below in case you want to go back and click through any of these things. Just open up the video description and click that link, and you can get to this presentation whenever you want. Again, my name is Dan Rodney, and thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this and gotten a lot out of it, and hope to see you in one of our classes or certificate programs in the future, or back for one of these webinars in a future time. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.